I am a happy sinner. I let go of the string and the arrow flies off the bow and it hits the target. Okay, not that red circle in the middle, but close enough on the target. Therefore, I am a happy sinner. In that August moment, in the woods of Southern California, I see where that first arrow I have shot since grade school has landed, and I think, not bad. After unsettled personal times, in the middle of an unsettled world, in the midst of a rich conference at DeBenneville Pines Retreat Center, it feels great to concentrate in that moment, to simply be attentive and focused on my hands, on the string and the bow, to watch where the arrow lands. I don't remember liking archery this much when I was in middle school. It might have been because of the really ugly two-toned polyester uniforms we had to wear for gym class. And it might be because our PE teachers were not nearly as kind and gentle as this UU camp leader has been about instructing us how to shoot the arrow. It might be because my companions are all faithful activists at this conference and not sullen preteens like me just doing what we have to do to get by in gym class. Whatever it is, it feels wonderful to pull back that string and shoot that arrow and see where it lands. Even once, in that particular time, on the bullseye, yes. Now, Rabbi Sharon Brous is the lead rabbi at ICAR, which is a Los Angeles congregation that caters mostly to people in their 20s and 30s, and she describes the journey of this time of the year this way. In the Jewish tradition, we journey from Rosh Hashanah at the beginning of the new year to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when we, after the period of discernment between these two, decide what it is that we have been doing that we would like to change. We realize, perhaps, that we have been carrying heavy resentments and that we want to let go of these, put them down, including ones about ourselves. I find it remarkable that at this time of beginnings, the Jewish people turn their attention to the places where they missed the mark. They turn their attention to these places where they fell short, because missing the mark, admitting it, and moving on is part of the focus of this time of year. There's a cartoon on the Unvirtuous Abbey page, Facebook, that captures it. It shows a man with a yarmulke looking up at a big, sort of bemused-looking God figure, and the man is saying, "I've always loved your early work." Shana Tova writes the poster, because last week was Rosh Hashanah, the start of the Jewish New Year. This is the most holy of seasons for Judaism, this early work from which Christianity and, of course, by default, our own particular radical offshoot tradition all come. These are what are known as the days of awe in the Jewish tradition. It's a time of reflection and soul-searching, which begins the new year. And Rabbi Abraham Heschel says, awe is a way of being in rapport with the mystery of all reality. Awe enables us to perceive in the world intimations of the divine, to sense in small things the beginning of the infinite significance, to sense the ultimate in the common and the simple, to feel in the rush of the passing the stillness of the eternal. And through this lens, the faithful emerge with a special emphasis on forgiveness, which we'll get to in a moment. I find it remarkable, as I said, that at this time of beginning, the Jewish people turn their attention towards the places where they have missed the mark. Just a little bit maybe, or maybe a lot. Repentance can be kind of wearisome. Rabbi Brous remembers how tedious she found these days when she was younger. But she says that they can also be joyous if they're done in a spirit of love. They can be liberating. She says, this notion of sin in our tradition is relevant because the Jewish word for sin derives from archery. The arrow shot towards the target that's just gone off course. That's what sin means in its original meaning. In my own synagogue, she says, we expand on this notion by singing the atonement prayers in these words. We say, who are we? We are God's image and truth and infinite wisdom. We are eternal goodness. And yet, we've abused, we've betrayed, we've been cruel, and yes, we've destroyed. Rather than see ourselves as at the core evil, she says the Jewish tradition sees us as created in that image of the divine, intrinsically good and worthy, and yet here with this understanding that we then, as people and citizens, can feel safe to explore where we've gone off course a little bit, where we've missed the mark, those places where we need a mid-course correction. This need to change is just that. It's not a condemnation. It's not a blaming or a shaming about who we are or our core beliefs, because in our belief structure, we believe that every human life has the potential for good. The word virtue comes from the same root as the words virulent and virile. At its core, the word comes simply from this idea of great strength. And in these times, perhaps, we could use the practice of virtues to turn our attention away from certain practices and behaviors which are actually depleting our strength, sending it towards things that we don't need to pay attention to, and away from those things which can make us resolved and able to be long-term in the struggle to create the kind of world we wish to have. This is the first in an occasional service, a series on contemporary virtues, which I'm going to be doing this year, because I believe that it's important for us to think about these things. And in our Sunday Salon, starting today, we're going to be looking at sources of strength from our tradition, core texts for our times. In these times, we need to think about our intentionality, about what mark we're aiming for, and what our resources are to get there. Our choices about what we want to notice, what we want to give our strength to, what we want to give our energy to in this world. If virtues are strengths, then I would say we need virtues. Now, we may reject a few traditional ideas about some traditional virtues. We might have, for example, a slightly different take on the role of chastity, for example, or even humility. But there are important parameters for us to look at. And these high holy days remind us that there's a time in our year to be conscious of what we're doing and to pledge to do something just a little bit more on mark with where we want to be and the role we want to play in the world. So I'm going to tell you a really shocking thing, something that I'm sure you don't already know, which is that none of us can live up to our aspirations. Surprising, isn't it? I know. But because of that, this gap between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur gives us the space to contemplate what it is we want to adjust. And there's an author that I really love, A.J. Jacobs. He knows about the inevitability of coming up short. He says, I've rarely said the word Lord with it unless it's followed by of the rings. He is the author of The Year of Living Biblically, one man's humble quest to follow the Bible as literally as possible. This is a book that makes me laugh out loud every time I read it. He says this about himself as a way of introduction. I am officially Jewish, but I'm Jewish in the same way that the Olive Garden is an Italian restaurant. This agnostic man raised completely outside of the religious part of his tradition, decided to spend a year trying to do every single thing that the Hebrew scriptures told him, not metaphorically, but literally. So no, AJ, out on this book stunt, tries to follow the letter of the text. And he does, sometimes in ways that are quite absurd. For example, when he drops a pebble on the shoe of a man he has met on a park bench who has admitted that he, in fact, has been unfaithful and therefore is an adulterer. I thought that religion, the man actually turns around and starts throwing rocks at him. It did not go well, just so you know, in case you're tempted to try that. He said, I thought religion would make me live with my head in the clouds, but as often as not, it grounds me in this world. He says this, I'm still agnostic, but now I'm a reverent agnostic, which isn't an oxymoron, I swear. I now believe, he says, that whether or not there's a God, there is such thing as sacredness. Life is sacred. The Sabbath can be a sacred day. Prayer can be a sacred ritual. There is something transcendent that is beyond the everyday. And it's possible, he says, that humans created this sacredness themselves, but that doesn't take away from its power or importance. Now I found that transcendence in that moment with the bow and the arrow. I find it liberating. So when my son, Liam, and I get to spend a whole day together last month, we take an archery class. The instructor, a trainer in a facility that entertains some of the best archers in the world, and tells us that what you do is you look and you see a pattern where your arrows have fallen or landed, and there's going to be a cluster there, and then you adjust your aim just a little bit based on what you've been doing. You might want to go a little lower or a little to the right or the left. This is the time of year when the Jewish wisdom practice instructs us to think about adjusting our sights just a little bit the way that archery instructor in Salt Lake City told me to do. Because this is a time in which we separately need all the strength and all the accuracy that we can, in fact, get, so that all the force of our effort will actually be going towards the target that we want and not someplace else. That's important in this world. Now, the philosopher Aristotle saw virtues as having a mean. That was what was down the middle. The virtue was what was on the mean. The middle place, there were places of excess and there were places of scarcity on either side of each virtue. So this works like this. Courage is a virtue. In excess, it becomes rashness. And in scarcity, it becomes cowardice. Magnanimity is a virtue, which in excess becomes vanity. And in scarcity, it becomes stinginess. Righteous indignation, which maybe a few of us have felt in these months gone by, is a virtue, he says. But in excess, it's envy and hatefulness. And when it is too scarce, it is spitefulness, and so on. The question here is, how do we find that place of balance in the middle, that target? These days of awe remind us that the perfect is always, always, always the enemy of the good, as the old adage says. The quest to be perfect, or the need to think of ourselves as impenetrably good, can make us unwilling to make that small adjustment that would mean that we would focus better, turn what might be excess or scarcity into virtue in our own actions. These days of awe invite us into a dialogue with ourselves about what it is that we need to adjust so that we can more clearly aim towards the mark we wish to hit. Our Berkeley neighbor, the Rabbi Michael Lerner, says, what makes Jewish tradition useful in this regard is that it focuses not only on our own individual lives, but on taking collective responsibility for our larger world as well. Last summer, in the otherworldliness of that Olympic training archery facility in Utah. When I shot those arrows the first couple times, my cluster was always just a little to the right and just a little above that red circle in the middle. I worked to adjust my view and my aim a little differently, and then I began to hit the bullseye a little more often. And my neighbor worked to adjust her aim and her view, and she stopped hitting my target and started hitting hers. My son, Liam, I was astounded to see, had amazing aim and hit the bullseye time after time. A focus on modern virtues can be very helpful, very balancing. And for this season in the Jewish tradition, the focus is on the virtue of forgiveness. A.J. Jacobs, the tongue-in-cheek agnostic, says, "There's a beauty to forgiveness, especially forgiveness that goes beyond rationality. Unconditional love is an illogical notion, but it is a great and powerful one." The virtue of forgiveness is the simple strength to be conscious of what we need to forgive and to make an effort to direct our energy away from the excess of anger and a sense of injury in a world in which we are battered by so many forces, and also away from an easy forgiveness which leaves people still hurt or harmed by that which has hurt or harmed us. Forgiveness is sometimes we are like that inexperienced archer and we totally miss the target. But the answer is not to never pick up a bow again. The answer is never to not let another arrow fly. The answer is found in refocusing. Forgiveness is not about being a doormat. It is not about being condemning and shaming. In an Aristotelian way, we do not need to allow someone who does harm back into our life in an active sense, but what we do need is to reduce and release all that energy which we have tied up in our anger towards that person. We can forgive and maintain boundaries. We can accept the human foibles of another without scorn or derision. Forgiveness is that middle way of virtue. So may these days of awe return us to our rightful path, at least for a little while, till we need another correction. Sharon Brous, who leads that congregation down in LA, says it's return. It's just simply returning to a righteous path. I mean, the whole Jewish notion of sin is just that you've gone astray and you can turn it around. We have the capacity as human beings, she says, to make great mistakes. And we have the capacity to turn it around. So I want to end again in contemplation of the words from my beloved teacher and colleague, the Reverend Rob Eller Isaacs, from our first hymn today, who brought his Jewish roots to his Unitarian Universalist faith. These are his words. For remaining silent when a single voice would have made a difference, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time our fears made us rigid and inaccessible, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time we have struck out in anger without just cause, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time our greed has blinded us to the needs of others, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For the selfishness that sets us apart and alone, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit, we forgive ourselves and each other. we begin again in love. For losing sight of our unity, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusion of separateness, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. We may not always hit the mark, but we can refocus, we can turn it around. So let us forgive ourselves and each other, and let us be the ones to begin again in love.